Hello guys. I've been told I should introduce myself. So my name is Karel Hála. I've been working in coding for almost 6 years. I started at Honeywell in year 2013. I started to work in PHP. Let me increase the size of the notes because they're really super inconvenience. Much better. Okay, so I started, as I said, I started to code in PHP. At first, I didn't really like PHP, but I got employed and I worked in PHP. Then I moved to Java, and I didn't quite really like JavaScript at the time. But then I started to like JavaScript, and I didn't really quite like React because of JSX and whatnot. And now I really like React, and I work in React. So I learned that I shouldn't hate or didn't like anything because I might work with it in the near future. And about myself, I really like sci-fi, all movies, games, books, whatever. And me and my father, we own a wine cellar, and we produce our own wine. So just interesting note. So in today's presentation, or today's talk, we're going to cover these three, let's hope, interesting topics. Okay, first of all, I saw that there are 50-50 programmers, developers who work in React, Angular, any sane language. Can you raise your hand, please? Okay, fairly good. Fairly good. Designers, don't worry, don't dive deeply into any codes and whatever. It's just for me to understand who is sitting in front of me. Okay, let's start with the presentation. We'll talk about how we handled component changes in Red Hat over the quite few years. After that, let's talk about how to communicate changes and tools, and which tools are good for UI migration. And in the end, we're going to discuss how communication is important when developing components library. This is actually our product. I think that many of you developers, or basically anybody, used Bootstrap before. It's really easy to use. You can just whack two files into your HTML and boom, it looks nice, at least somewhat nice. And if you have skilled designers or anyone who is skilled with some tools, can change the design for your likes. So that's also a good thing. But different levels of programmers can cause some really unwanted bugs and errors, and it's very hard to find those bugs in long run. And sadly, Bootstrap doesn't support fully the single-page application out of the box. You can always go around it with some other framework or whatever, but that's not coming fully out of the Bootstrap. And that's the reason we don't want to wait a couple of seconds before another page loads and whatnot. And as your application gets bigger, it might mean that the static files will get bigger as well, and the load times will be increased. So we decided to start coding our custom components based on Bootstrap. So we found out, okay, this Bootstrap table or this Bootstrap accordion looks good, but we want to improve it in some way. So we currently have a lot of components in our stack. I don't remember the exact number, sorry. And we are leaning heavily on some libraries, let's say for tables and charts. I'm gonna discuss the tables afterwards. And a lot of bugs are caught like by someone else, because we are using libraries that are already in use and in flight in other applications and by other people around the world. A lot of bugs are caught on Stack Overflow, and it's really funny to do code review and find some Stack Overflow part in there. Okay, so what might cause problems with this is we found that custom styling is harder and harder. Is getting harder and harder for us because we have so much like components and so many like styles and everything. It's getting harder and harder. We had to trust in our libraries we picked. Recently, we found out that our table component that we lean heavily on, React Tabular, is getting stale. The developer who started the library is not coding it anymore, and it's like we don't know what to do currently because we are like it's heavily injected into one of our components. And right now the static files gets really huge. I think it's around 5 megabytes of JavaScript and CSS, which is not that good. And we also had to write our own components for each framework. So firstly, we started to support Angular 1.6. Then we started to support React as well. And now we have to support, obviously, Angular 2 because that's been a huge change. So we have 3 frameworks that we have to support, and we recently started to, there's a new thing called web components. Can we start coding web components as well? So that's another thing. So it's not that good. So we decided to start work on custom components with custom styles and CSS variables and grids and everything, all those goodies, you know. We split our code base into multiple packages, one for tables, one for charts, one for just custom components. And we focused heavily on the usability. So let's discuss how the change communication can happen when you are developing any new components, or you want to switch from one framework to another, or from one design library to another. I'm gonna discuss with you one upgrade path, different styles, different approaches, what to do and such. How to communicate change scenarios, and I'll finish up with the upgrade tools. So 2 milestones when upgrading any application to new stylings is to identify components first. You have to know which components can be replaced with which components in one project and in the other project. And you also have to know how you are going to update each page individually. So first approach is one component at a time. It's really easy to test and really easy to review. You just, let's say you want to replace every button in your application with a new button that is really fancy and you really like it. So you just hit Ctrl-Shift-R and replace the button in every code. Or you can change one screen at a time. You will go to one screen, one component, one huge component, and you replace every part there, like in one huge PR. This is really good because you have consistency per page. So you don't have like one page looks differently, but one page will look differently, but the one page will look the same. It's less bug prone because you don't have to handle one component can treat the data differently than the other one, and you don't really have to care about that because you are working on one screen. And the third one, probably the best, is combination. It takes good parts from both, sadly bad parts as well. But you can take, let's say, 2 programmers and say, okay, I want you to change this entire screen to use the new components. So they will start to do small PRs just to replace buttons, alerts on the screen, and everything, and it will happen only on the screen. One thing to note, if you are working in sprints or releases, always replace the entire screen. Don't have like part of the screen replaced and part of not. So let's, as you can see on the in the top corner, let's identify the components that we want to change, and let's identify the upgrade method. I already did it for you. So identified that we wanted to change the tabs, pagination, navigation, basic information, and detail info, and basically just change the styles of the page entirely. I chose combination because it was much easier to do, and it was much better to have smaller PRs instead of one huge PR to change the entire screen. Okay, so how which change scenarios can happen in your application? Well, the first one is just an attribute change. On the left side, there's Buttonfly 3 button that is based on Bootstrap, and on the right side, there's Buttonfly 4 button, which is our own implementation of button and our custom styles and everything. The change only means for us that we will change the package from which we import the button, and only the attribute. As you can see, with the Buttonfly 3 Bootstrap style, it's PS style primary, and with the Buttonfly 4, it's called variant primary. We chose the primary. Yeah. So the communication. How should the developers of these new components should communicate the changes to consumers, you might ask? Well, the best way is to add warning messages. Always add warning messages in console, because users should not see the console for themselves, and if they see, they know what they are doing. If they don't know what they're doing, well, bummer for them. I would also like to point out that always put a link with the information what should be changed and how to change it, because you might end up on a page with, let's say, 4 buttons on the screen, and every button will trigger a new warning. So you don't want to pollute the console log that much. Also, with this example, you want to have backwards compatibility. So you want to have both attributes at the same time or interchangeable. So if you are using the new component and you are still using the BS variant in there, you can still use it, but you will find out in console that you shouldn't use BS variant anymore because that's deprecated. This approach can be really easily scripted, let's say by code mods. I'm going to talk about that later on. Another design change scenario that happened to us, and this one really bite us really hard. It took us a couple of hours to find out what happened. Is that at one point our component designers went from select to firm select, and from select option to firm select option, and they didn't notify anybody over any communication channel. So there were no attribute changes, only the renames of the component. For them, it was like, oh, nothing changed, but for us, it meant a couple of hours of finding the problem. And when we finally found it out, we were so like, why didn't we got any notification? So how can you avoid this? Nothing's easier than exporting the select again. So you will end up with the same component at the same time for some time, but you won't break it for others. Also add warning messages there, so that when the consumers of these components are using them, they will see that they shouldn't be using them or something like that. Okay, last design change I would like to show you is we went from rounded buttons to squared buttons, and from input to input with underline. There were no API changes, only this design change. So it's not that hard. It wasn't that hard for us, but you still might want to communicate these changes to your consumers. And you might ask how. Always use class prefixes. So you don't end up with a class button or whatever. So you want to have one custom class prefix, let's say PFC button for buttonfly buttons, and ESC for, let's say, the application buttons, custom stylings of the buttons. And also you want to include the changelog and demo information. So when newcomers or the ones who are already using your components come up to your demo page, they can see the examples, and they will also see, let's say, a message, notification, something like that. Okay, look up, we in recent version, let's say 1.24.17, we changed the buttons from rounded corners to square corners. Okay. So which tools are good for these upgrades? I really like code mode and JS code shift, because together you just write some simple scripts that goes through your code base, and they replace your imports, attributes. They can combine attributes together. They can have default values and whatnot. Yeah. It's relatively easy to use by the consumers. They can pick which component they want to upgrade, which screen they want to apply this to be applied to, and so on and so forth. However, it's really good to have skilled programmers to write these scripts, because you want to write them relatively easy for the consumers, and at the same time you want to keep the upgrade path up to date, so you don't end up with the different attributes in one version and so on. Okay, in our last part of the presentation, I'm gonna talk about design implementation and usage workflow. I'll show you one great workflow, at least I think it's great, of how to communicate custom component library. I'll introduce participants and what are their roles, and last part will be about deciding how the participants should communicate to one and each other. Okay, we have 4 participants over here: designer, styles developer, component developer, and consumer. Designer, well, he designs things based on the consumer's requirements, and he produces designs, obviously. Styles developer, he takes these styles, these designs that were designed by the designer. He creates CSS and HTML out of them. By the way, these don't have to be the 2 persons. They can be 1 person at the same time, or they can be multiple persons. And component developer, well, then takes the CSS and HTML parts and puts some logic on top of it with JavaScripts, animations, some fancy stuff and such. Again, the component developer can be styles developer, designer, any permutations you want to like. It's just for design to show these roles to you. And lastly, the consumer is not actually your application user. It's the person that takes your components and uses them in their application. So he is using the components created by the component developer, and he creates requirements. He sees that, okay, in my mockup I have one page that has this this alert, but I can't find it anywhere. What should I do? Should I do some CSS by myself or whatnot? And so so the consumer asks the designer, okay, I want a component. The component looks like this, and it should behave like this, and everything. It doesn't have to be directly consumer to designer. It can be consumer to anybody or anybody to anybody, because we might find out when developing a new component that this component should be split up into multiple components and such. So once the designer knows his work, he should always discuss this with component developer. Otherwise, it might mean it might mean that the designer will design something that is not really that wanted, or it's just a variation of some component that is already been like produced, or it might mean even that we created one component badly and we should rewrite a custom component in different way and split it into multiple components, let's say, and such. So once the designer knows what he should do, he designs the stuff. Styles developer will take his stuff and implements the styles and HTMLs as much as he knows them. Then the component developer will take these CSS, HTMLs, and everything. He will chop them up into multiple components so they can be refactored rather easily, and put some JavaScript on top of it, animations, everything that is fancy for him. And consumer will then use this component and has obviously some bug reports and some objections to the component, how it behaves and everything. So the entire team should then take care of this component, take care of these bugs, and will basically babysit this new component, these new components, or whatever it is. Okay, one obligatory mention for Patternfly. If you visit patternfly.org, that's our Patternfly 3 version. It's based on Bootstrap. It's really good. The React implementation has a lot of components, like a ton of them. But as I said, it's bundled rather badly, and you'd end up with a huge static files. So if you'd rather use the new stuff, you should use pf4.patternfly.org. It doesn't have that much of component because it was started rather recently. It was, I guess, a year ago, almost not a year ago, but it uses the new stuff. So be worried about it, that it doesn't fully support Internet Explorer, because it's using CSS variables, it's using grids, and other things that are not fully supported in Internet Explorer. Okay, thank you all for listening, and I hope you really enjoyed the talk, learned something new, heard something interesting, or just good time. And yeah, so if you have any questions or answers, feel free to ask.